This video was brought to you by NordVPN. We're now more than 6 months on from the October 7th Hamas attacks and the beginning of Israel's war in Gaza, and there remains no end in sight. With the tide of public opinion seemingly turning against Israel, Hamas still in operation, and more than 100 hostages still in Gaza, is Israel actually losing the war? In this video, we're going to explore this in 3 parts. The damage being done to Israel's international standing, the domestic pressures on the Israeli government, and whether it's actually achieving its war aims. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, let's start with the international angle. The growing Palestinian death toll in Gaza, now at more than 33,000, a devastating humanitarian crisis, warnings of famine, and a restriction of aid flow have all contributed to Israel's increasing international isolation. However, in recent weeks, the single biggest event to have prompted a reassessment of support for Israel among many of its allies was the killing of 7 World Central Kitchen aid workers by 3 successive Israeli drone strikes, described by Israel as a serious mistake stemming from a serious failure. Those killed were a Palestinian, 3 British nationals, a Polish national, an Australian national, and a dual Canadian-American citizen. As such, the killings sparked immense international backlash from the countries affected and further afield, with Israel's explanation doing little to assuage this anger. In fact, the UK government is now coming under increased pressure to suspend arms sales and military cooperation with Israel, and Foreign Secretary David Cameron has warned that British backing for Israel is not unconditional. Meanwhile, there are also growing calls from within the US Democratic Party for President Biden to condition his military assistance for Israel based on its actions, prompting Biden to warn Netanyahu that US policy will be determined on Israel's implementation of specific, concrete, and measurable steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers. This, plus the US's decision to abstain on, rather than veto, a UN Security Council resolution demanding a ceasefire in Gaza, represent notable shifts in American foreign policy. In fact, a memo from the US State Department following a meeting with their Israeli counterparts states that the Israelis seemed oblivious to the fact that they're facing major, possibly generational damage to their reputation, not just in the region, but elsewhere in the world. It adds, "We are concerned that the Israelis are missing the forest for the trees and are making a strategic error in writing off their reputational damage." Even former President Donald Trump has altered his rhetoric on Israel, warning that Israel is losing a lot of its support because of its actions in Gaza, adding that Israel has got to get better with public relations, because right now they're really being hurt very badly. But the pressure on the Israeli government isn't just coming from abroad. Benjamin Netanyahu is also under significant domestic pressure from all sides. Following the 2022 election, Netanyahu formed Israel's furthest right government ever, and even given his narrow majority, keeping those far-right elements on side has always been crucial to his government's survival. But now, in the face of international pressure to halt the military offensive in Gaza and not invade Rafah, the more extreme factions in his government are piling on pressure to do the opposite. In fact, just this week, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir said that if Netanyahu decides to end a war without an extensive attack on Rafah in order to defeat Hamas, he will not have a mandate to continue serving as Prime Minister. At the same time, far-right Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich voiced his own frustration that the exclusive and smaller wartime cabinet was making significant decisions without the approval of the full cabinet, something that he said was harming the war's momentum and our security interests. On the flip side, the more centrist elements of the wartime government are also ratcheting up the pressure. Benny Gantz, who joined Netanyahu's unity cabinet after October 7th, but remains his single biggest political rival, broke ranks and openly called for early elections in the country, saying that the vote should be held in September. Now, this is completely at odds with what Netanyahu has said, with him repeatedly rejecting calls for early elections, saying that it would undermine the war effort and Israeli unity. But Gantz has basically flipped the script by saying that elections are necessary to preserve unity and renew the trust between Israeli citizens and their government. Now, polls suggest that Netanyahu's approval ratings have collapsed after the October 7th attacks, and that Gantz and his party now have the most to gain from an election, with Netanyahu's right-wing coalition expected to lose its majority to the anti-Netanyahu bloc. Meanwhile, on the street, Netanyahu's government faces renewed mass protests, calling for a deal to secure the release of the remaining 130 or so hostages from Gaza, as well as demanding that Netanyahu resigns and there are early elections. There's also a separate political crisis going on related to the possible drafting of ultra-Orthodox Haredi Jews into the military, something that has the potential to fracture and bring down Netanyahu's coalition too. But anyway, despite this growing international pressure and the political instability the war is causing, is Israel actually achieving its aims? Well, the Israeli government set out two main objectives following the October 7th attacks by Hamas that killed nearly 1,200 people in Israel. These aims were to eradicate Hamas and rescue the hostages. So let's start with defeating Hamas. Now, this is tricky to assess because yes, the Israeli military has taken control of most of Gaza, and it claims to have killed 13,000 or so Hamas fighters, including several senior figures. But as the international crisis group's Israel-Palestine senior analyst says, the IDF hasn't been able to get the top brass of the Hamas leadership. Also, from the beginning of the war, critics pointed out that the aim of eradicating Hamas may be something of an impossible goal for Israel to set itself. That's because destroying an entity is one thing, but destroying an ideology and a movement is another much more difficult task, especially when you consider that Hamas's position that violent armed resistance against Israel is necessary could well have been emboldened as a result of Israel's response to October 7th. So what about the goal of freeing the hostages? Well, of the 253 hostages that were taken from Israel, there are 129 yet to be returned from Gaza, at least 34 of whom are thought to be dead. 109 hostages did get their freedom through prisoner exchanges or other deals, while just 3 have been rescued directly by Israeli military operations, and 12 bodies have been recovered, including 3 that were mistakenly killed by the Israeli army. So ultimately, political deals via mediators with Hamas have proven to be more effective at rescuing hostages than military action alone, which effectively puts this hostage goal at odds with the first goal of destroying Hamas. There are tentative signs, though, that things are starting to go in a different direction, at least for now. A new round of truce talks are underway in Cairo, and Israel has withdrawn most of its brigades from the Gaza Strip, signaling a lull in fighting that's allowed some Gazans to return to their homes, or what's left of them, in the southern city of Khan Yunis. But with Netanyahu still vowing to press ahead with an invasion of Rafah, this lull may not last. Now, watching our videos, it's understandable if, at times, you feel like the world isn't terribly safe. And unfortunately, this can be the case online too. You might try your best to keep everything secure. Maybe you rotate through a few favorite passwords online, but that's not always enough to keep you safe. In fact, the most common form of account hacking these days is called credential stuffing. Essentially, if you use one of your normal passwords on a website that's poorly maintained and then gets compromised, you could find that your information ends up landing on the dark web. Then hackers just attempt the same email and password combination on other websites, your social media accounts, streaming services, banks. You get the point. Luckily for you though, NordVPN has a whole bunch of tools that can keep you safe online, with their suite of threat protection tools including a dark web monitor, which notifies you if someone leaks your credentials. It's not just that though, their threat protection can also warn you about phishing links and block malicious ads before you even see them. It really is all-round protection for your digital life. And if you sign up for a 2-year plan using our link, you'll not only get a massive discount, but you'll also get 4 extra months free. So if you want to support the channel and improve our journalism, then make sure you use the link in the description so that they know you came from us. And that way you'll also get their great service at a discount.